Manchester, England. November 2004. Roy Keane was sitting in a television studio, still in his playing kit. Sweat barely dry from another battle on the pitch, and he was angry. Not the controlled, calculated anger of a man choosing his words carefully. The raw, unfiltered anger of someone who genuinely believed what he was about to say, who had believed it for years, and who had finally decided the world needed to hear it clearly. The interviewer leaned forward. "What do you make of Ronaldinho's style of play? The tricks, the flicks, the dancing on the ball?" Keane didn't hesitate. Not even for a second. "It's disrespectful," he said. "All that dancing, all those tricks. It's showboating. Football is war, not a circus. You play to win. You play for your teammates. You play for the badge. Not to entertain yourself. Not to make people laugh. Not to dance." The quote went everywhere. Within hours it was in every newspaper in England, Portugal, Spain, Brazil, every football website, every radio program, every pub conversation. Roy Keane, the most ferocious competitor of his generation, the captain who defined an era at Manchester United, the man whose name was synonymous with professional fury, had looked at the most joyful footballer alive and called him disrespectful. In Barcelona, a journalist tracked down Ronaldinho the following afternoon. He was coming off the training pitch at the Camp Nou, still smiling as he always was, his dreadlocks loose, his shirt untucked, moving with that unhurried rhythm that seemed to belong to a different world than the one Roy Keane inhabited. "Ronaldinho, Roy Keane said your style is disrespectful to football. He said football is war, not a circus. What do you say to that?" Ronaldinho stopped walking. He looked at the journalist for a moment. Then he looked at the camera. Then he smiled, that enormous, full-faced smile that had become the most recognizable expression in world football. "I hope he enjoys watching," he said. And then he walked away. 3 weeks later, the watching happened. And what Roy Keane watched changed the conversation forever. But to understand why that moment mattered, you need to go back further. Much further. You need to go back to a neighborhood in Porto Alegre, Brazil, where a boy named Ronaldo de Assis Moreira first learned that a football was not a weapon of war. It was something else entirely. Porto Alegre in the early 1980s was not an easy place to grow up. The Vila Nova neighborhood where the Assis family lived was working class, tight. João de Assis Moreira, Ronaldinho's father, worked as a shipyard welder. He loved football the way most Brazilians love it, not as a career possibility, but as an expression of something deeper, something cultural and communal. When Ronaldinho was 8 years old, João died of a heart attack. The family tightened. Ronaldinho's mother, Miguelina, worked. His older brother Roberto stepped into a bigger role, and Ronaldinho, the youngest, the most sensitive, went to the one place that made the world make sense. He went to play football. Here is what people who watched Ronaldinho as a child remember. Not the tricks. Not the technique, though that was obvious even then. What they remember is the expression on his face. He played with his mouth open, laughing. Not the polite smile of someone performing for approval. A genuine, uncontrolled joy that seemed to start somewhere deep inside him and work its way outward until it was impossible to contain. His coach at Grêmio's youth academy, a man who had trained dozens of promising young Brazilian players, said something that the people around him never forgot. "I have coached talented players my whole life. But Ronaldinho is the first one I have ever coached who plays football the way the rest of us dream about it." When most people dream about football, they do not dream about tactics. They dream about moments. The ball arriving at exactly the right angle. The first touch so perfect it seems like the ball is responding to a thought rather than a physical action. The movement through space that bends the laws of physics just enough to leave every defender reaching for air. That was what Ronaldinho played like. Every time he touched the ball, he played like the dream. Roy Keane had never played like the dream. This is not an insult. Roy Keane was something else, something that required a completely different kind of greatness. Keane played like the nightmare. The nightmare of his opponents. The nightmare of any midfielder who thought he could take a touch too many, hold the ball too long, turn without knowing where Keane was. For a decade at Manchester United, Roy Keane was the human embodiment of relentless competitive pressure. He was the reason his teammates ran harder in the second half than the first. He was the reason referees checked their watches more carefully when he was on the pitch. He won by force of will. He bent matches to his desire through sheer refusal to accept any outcome other than the one he needed. These are two fundamentally different philosophies of football. And in November 2004, when Keane called Ronaldinho's style disrespectful, he was not just making a comment about one player. He was making a statement about what football was for, about what it meant, about whether the beauty of the game was legitimate or a distraction from the only thing that mattered, which was winning. There has always been a tension in every competitive discipline that contains an element of art, between the functional and the beautiful, between what works and what transcends. Football is not immune to this tension. The history of the game is full of arguments about what football is really for. Whether the goal justifies every means employed to reach it. Whether a beautiful defeat is more valuable than an ugly victory. Roy Keane, without stating it in philosophical terms, was on the side of results. His career had been built on the belief that football's purpose was singular and clear: to win. Everything else, including grace, including beauty, including the kind of free, flowing joy that made crowds gasp, was vanity. Selfishness dressed up as skill. Ronaldinho, without stating it in any terms at all, because Ronaldinho rarely made arguments, he simply demonstrated them, was on the other side entirely. He played as if the purpose of football was not only to win, but to make people feel something. That joy was not a reward for winning, but a presence that could exist inside the game itself, in the touch and the turn and the pass that no one saw coming. Neither of them was wrong, exactly. But in November 2004, the world had not yet fully decided which of them was right. And then came the match. The match was a Champions League group stage encounter at the Camp Nou. Barcelona against a strong visiting side. It was broadcast live across Europe, South America, Asia, reaching an audience that stretched into the hundreds of millions. Not because anyone had arranged it that way, but because Barcelona that season had become compulsory viewing. People could not stop watching. They watched the way you watch something that you know, instinctively, will not last. Something that is happening now, in this specific moment, and that you will want to have seen when it is over. Ronaldinho was 24 years old. He was at the absolute peak of his physical powers. His body, which had always been deceptively athletic beneath the relaxed exterior, was performing at a level that even his coaches described as startling. His touch had always been special. But that season, it had become something beyond technical description. Players who trained with him every day still found themselves stopping to watch when he did something in a practice session that none of them had seen before. The match began. The visiting team, well-organized, compact, disciplined, had clearly studied Barcelona's patterns. They pressed high. They denied space in midfield. They tried to take away the rhythm that Barcelona needed to breathe and move and think. For the first 20 minutes, it worked. Barcelona were slightly hesitant. The passing was less fluid than usual. There were moments of uncertainty. The visiting team grew in confidence, their pressing becoming more aggressive, their shape growing tighter. Then the ball came to Ronaldinho. He received it with his back to goal, about 35 meters out. A defender arrived immediately, tight, physical. In these situations, the correct technical response is simple control turn, release quickly. Keep the ball moving. Do not invite a challenge in your own half with your back turned. Ronaldinho did not do the correct technical thing. He waited. Not long. A fraction of a second. But in football, fractions of seconds are entire sentences. The defender adjusted, anticipating the turn. Ronaldinho felt the adjustment without looking, and then he did something that caused the commentator, a man who had been describing football professionally for 22 years, to simply stop speaking for a moment because there was nothing in his vocabulary that was equal to what he was seeing. Ronaldinho rolled the ball back with the sole of his foot, spun the other direction, left the defender standing with his weight on entirely the wrong foot, and in the same motion flicked the ball 40 meters through the air to a teammate making a run that nobody else on the pitch had noticed. The pass arrived perfectly. Not perfectly enough. The move came to nothing in the end. No goal. No assist. Just the movement, the spin. The pass into space. But the stadium had already changed. You can hear it on the broadcast recording. The first 20 minutes had been quiet. The Camp Nou crowd murmuring with mild concern. And then, after that one touch, that one movement, the atmosphere shifted physically. Like a pressure change. Like the moment before a storm when the air itself seems to recognize what is coming. Ronaldinho had not done something new. That kind of spin, that kind of awareness, he had done versions of it 1,000 times. But in that moment, in that match, against that defensive pressure, it was a statement. It was the answer to a question that had been hanging in the air since November, since the words in the television studio, since the quote in every newspaper. Is this disrespectful? Watch. Is this a circus? Watch. Is this war? No. It is not war. It is something better than war. Watch. Over the next 70 minutes, Ronaldinho produced a performance that professional analysts and football historians would discuss for the next 20 years. Not because of the statistics, though the statistics were extraordinary. Not because of the goals, though there were goals, and they were beautiful. Because of the accumulation of moments, the way each one built on the last. The way every decision he made seemed to come from a different dimension of tactical understanding than the one the opposing team was playing in. He scored twice. The first was a free kick struck with such precise technique that the goalkeeper, who was excellent, positioned correctly, experienced in this situation, could only watch it pass him. The ball moved through the air in a curve that seemed to accelerate at the end, bending late, arriving in a corner that had appeared closed. The goalkeeper stood still for a moment after the ball hit the net, not because he was slow, because he was experiencing something that took a moment to process. The second goal was different. It came from a position of seeming impossibility. The angle was wrong. The defenders were positioned correctly. Logic, experience. Everything that serious professional football training teaches you about where goals come from and where they cannot come from, said this was not a goal-scoring opportunity. Ronaldinho assessed the situation in approximately 1/3 of a second and decided that logic was not relevant here. He struck the ball with the outside of his right foot, generating a curve that bent it around the wall of defenders and into the net. The entire stadium fell completely, totally silent for 1 full second, before the noise that followed made it impossible to hear anything at all. But it was not the goals that people kept rewatching in the days that followed. It was a moment in the second half that did not result in a goal, a moment that had no statistical value whatsoever, a moment that existed purely as an expression of what Ronaldinho was. He received the ball on the right side of the pitch. Two defenders came at him simultaneously. This is a standard defensive technique. 2 against 1. Force the decision. One defender approaches directly, taking away the space in front. The second comes from a slight angle, cutting off the turn. Between them, they cover every conventional option. Pass back, pass sideways, take the fall, or try to beat one of them, creating the opportunity for the other to win the ball. Ronaldinho beat both of them at the same time. Not consecutively, not first one and then the other, at the same time, with a movement so compact and so precisely timed that the two defenders essentially walked into each other as he went between them, leaving him free in the space behind with the ball at his feet, and the crowd on its feet, and the commentator, again, briefly unable to speak. He did not score from that position either. He passed sideways, kept possession. Nothing came of it in terms of the result. It did not matter. That is what people missed in the argument that Keane had started about whether this kind of play was disrespectful, whether it served the team or only the individual. They missed the thing that Ronaldinho understood at an almost cellular level. The thing that made his football different from simple showboating, different from tricks for their own sake. His joy made the people around him better. When Ronaldinho was on the pitch, his teammates played differently. Not just because his passing was exceptional, though it was. Not just because he drew defenders toward him, creating space for others, though he did that constantly. They played differently because of what it felt like to play alongside him. Something opened up. Something loosened. The fear that quietly accompanies every professional footballer, the fear of mistakes, of criticism, of failure, seemed to recede slightly in his presence, and when that fear receded, players did things they would not normally attempt. They took risks. They moved into spaces they might normally have considered too ambitious. They believed, briefly, that the extraordinary was possible. This is not something that can be measured, but it is real. Every player who shared a dressing room with Ronaldinho at Barcelona has said some version of it. The feeling of playing with him was different. He elevated the game around him, not just tactically but spiritually, if that word can be used in relation to football, and perhaps it can, perhaps it should. After the match ended, a journalist in the press area found the manager of the visiting team. A serious, experienced man who had been in football for 30 years, and who chose his words carefully. "How do you defend against Ronaldinho?" the journalist asked. The manager thought for a moment. "You prepare," he said. "You study him. You assign players to positions. You practice specific defensive responses to specific movements. And then, the match starts, and you realize that you have prepared for everything except what actually happens. Because what actually happens has never happened before. He invents it during the match." He paused. "I have been in this game for 30 years, he said. "I have been in this game for 30 years, and I still cannot tell you how he does what he does." 2 weeks after the match, a journalist tracked down Roy Keane at Manchester United's training ground. Keane was between sessions, standing near the pitch with a coffee. Watching the younger players work, "Ronaldinho had quite a match last week," the journalist said carefully. Keane said nothing for a moment. "He can play," Keane said finally. The words were quiet, measured, each one chosen. "Have you changed your view? About his style? About whether it's disrespectful?" Keane looked at the journalist. The expression on his face was not softened. Roy Keane's face was not built for softening. But there was something in it. Something that might have been, in another man, in a different light, respect. "A can play," Keane said again, and he walked back toward the training ground. It was not a concession speech. It was not a public reversal. It was Roy Keane being Roy Keane, which meant never giving more than was absolutely required. but people who knew him. People who had played with him and against him and stood near him when football was discussed, said that from that point on, the tone of his comments about Ronaldinho changed, not the manner. The manner never changed. But the tone. There was something different in it. Later that season, in an end-of-year interview for a football magazine, Keane was asked again about Ronaldinho. The question was framed carefully. Did he believe that joyful, expressive football had a place in the serious business of winning? Keane was quiet for a long time. For Keane, any silence longer than a second meant something was being genuinely considered. "There are different ways to compete," he said finally. "I compete the way I compete. He competes the way he competes. The result tells you who won. The result doesn't always tell you who was right." He stopped there. That was everything he was willing to give. But it was more than he had given before. And from Roy Keane, from the man who had made an entire career out of refusing to concede anything to anyone, it was considerable. Ronaldinho was never asked about this follow-up quote. He probably never read it. He was in Barcelona, training, preparing for the next match, living in that uncomplicated way that seemed so effortless from the outside, and was, in reality, the product of a discipline so deep it had ceased to feel like discipline at all. He had stopped thinking about the argument, if he had ever really started. He had made his response the only way he knew how. He had played. But here is the thing about that response, about the way he chose to answer, about the smile in the press conference, the single sentence, and then the 70 minutes of football that spoke in a language louder than anything either of them had said out loud. Ronaldinho could have defended himself. He was intelligent enough. He understood what Keane was saying and why Keane was saying it. He knew the argument. He had heard versions of it his whole life, from coaches who told him to be more direct, more efficient, less concerned with the flourish and more concerned with the outcome. He had heard it at Gremio as a teenager. He had heard versions of it at Paris Saint-Germain. He would hear it again, in different forms, for the rest of his career. He had never once answered it with words. Not because he had nothing to say. Because he understood, at a level that went below conscious thought, that words were the wrong medium for this particular argument. You cannot prove that joy belongs in football by talking about it. You cannot demonstrate that beauty is not the enemy of winning by writing an essay or giving an interview or making a speech. You can only play. You can only step onto the pitch and show, in real time, with real defenders and real pressure and real consequence, that it is possible to be joyful and effective simultaneously. That the dancing and the winning are not in opposition. That the circus and the war can occupy the same 90 minutes without one destroying the other. He showed it that night in Barcelona. He had shown it dozens of times before and would show it dozens of times again. Roy Keane's question was honest. The people who asked versions of that question over the years were not wrong to ask it. The question deserved an answer. It got one. It got an answer that no one in that stadium that night could disagree with, regardless of what they had believed about football before the match started. Ronaldinho would end that season with the Ballon d'Or, or the award given to the best footballer in the world. He would win it the following year as well. He would win the Champions League with Barcelona. He would remain, for the rest of his career and long after it ended, the answer people gave when they were asked to describe what it felt like to love football. Not what it meant to win. What it felt like, in the body and the chest and somewhere harder to name, to love the game. Years later, a Brazilian journalist writing a retrospective on Ronaldinho's career asked a simple question to everyone he interviewed. What did Ronaldinho make you feel? He interviewed coaches, opponents, teammates, journalists, stadium workers, people who had watched him play from the stands. He interviewed men and women who had been children during the Barcelona years and who remembered watching him for the first time. He compiled their answers. No two answers were exactly the same, but all of them contained one word, in various forms, in various contexts, described in various ways: joy. Not the joy of winning. Not the satisfied, relieved, validated joy of a final whistle. The other kind, the rarer kind. The joy that arrives when something beautiful happens in front of you, and you have not earned it, and you have not expected it, and you have nothing to do with it except witness it, and feel it move through you. That is what he gave people. That is what Roy Keane could not account for in his philosophy of football as war. That is what the television studio in Manchester, and the newspaper quotes, and the pub conversations about whether tricks are disrespectful had all somehow missed. The war ends. The circus packs up. The result is recorded and filed and eventually forgotten, except by those who care enough to look it up. But the feeling, the specific, unrepeatable, physical feeling of watching Ronaldinho receive a ball in a difficult position under real pressure with real consequence and do something with it that you had never seen before, and that made you, involuntarily, against your better judgment, in the middle of all the seriousness of competition, laugh. That stays. That is still with everyone who was there. Everyone who watched. Everyone who sat in those seats, or stood at those bars, or leaned toward those television screens and saw something happen that they could not explain, and did not need to explain, because the explanation was unnecessary, and the feeling was enough. Roy Keane competed as if football was the only thing that mattered. That kind of dedication produces greatness. It produces trophies and records and the fear of opponents and the devotion of fans who love a warrior. Ronaldinho played as if football was a gift. Not a gift he was giving to anyone in particular. A gift he had been given, and that he was, every time he stepped onto a pitch, simply returning to the world in the form it deserved to take. Both of those things can be true. The world needs warriors, and it needs dreamers, and it needs the ones who play as if joy and winning are not a choice between two things, but the same thing, expressed at the same moment, in the same touch, in the same smile on the face of a boy from Porto Alegre who never once stopped playing the way he had played on the streets of Villanova, when his father was still alive and the weight of expectation had not yet found him. The smile. That is what people always come back to. Reporters who interviewed him, commentators who spent years describing his play, fans who watched from the upper tiers of the Camp Nou. They all come back to the smile. Not the smile in the press conference, though that one was perfectly chosen. The smile during play. The smile in the middle of a match, under pressure, when a trick came off, or a pass arrived exactly where he had imagined it, when the dream and the reality briefly merged, and for one moment on a football pitch everything was exactly as it should be. He smiled because he meant it. He smiled because the game, even at its most pressured, even at its most consequential, even surrounded by Keane's war and the world's expectations and the weight of being the person everyone needed him to be, was still, fundamentally, still joy to him. Roy Keane was right about many things. He was right about discipline. He was right about professionalism. He was right about what it costs to compete at the highest level and what it demands of you and what you have to be willing to sacrifice. He was wrong about one thing. He was wrong about the circus. The circus, it turned out, was also the point.